All right, everybody, it is time to get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to BugFest. That's right, it is time. Today kicks off the museum's 20 something annual BugFest celebration. Today and tomorrow and through Saturday, we will be bringing you all kinds of bug arthropod goodness from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Normally, we have BugFest on a big Saturday downtown Raleigh. 35,000 people come out to visit the museum and take part in exhibits, games, crafts, activities, all kinds of amazing fun stuff. Since we can't do that this year, guess what we're doing? We're bringing you a week-long celebration of all things creepy, crawly, squishy, slimy, crunchy. That's what we're doing. It's BugFest time. I'm so excited. We'll be here on the museum's YouTube channel every day this week through Saturday at noon, bringing you special guest presentations. So we'll meet scientists who are studying all kinds of amazing arthropods. You can join us right there in the chat box. You can leave your questions, comments as we go throughout the program. Do that. Let us know what you think about the presentation and post questions as we go. At the end of the sort of presentation part of today's show, I'll actually be pulling the chat up and I'll pose your questions to our very special guest. Now, every year, if you've been following BugFest for a while, you know that we have a theme arthropod, a sort of a theme bug every single year. This year is the fly. And what you might not know is that mosquitoes are a type of fly, right? Look at that. You already learned something new being here in BugFest. And we happen to have a mosquito expert with us for today's noontime program. I want to bring on from North Carolina State University, Dr. Michael Reiskind. Michael, welcome.
Thank you, Chris. And I want to thank everybody at BugFest. You guys do a wonderful job every year. We love being part of a BugFest, and we love being there when we can actually interact with people. This year's a little different, as we all know, but we're adjusting. I've been excited to cover mosquitoes at BugFest for years now. I've been asking the organizers, can we do mosquitoes? And so finally, well, we got good enough. We got flies, which is the whole group that includes mosquitoes. So I'm going to talk to you guys out there in the ether for about 20-25 minutes about mosquitoes, just some basic biology of mosquitoes, why they're important, kind of what they do, and some interesting anecdotes about mosquitoes, but we won't cover everything. And so at the end of that, there's going to be plenty of time for you guys to, scratch that itch of questions about mosquitoes. So if you guys will give me a second, I'm going to share my screen with you and have a little PowerPoint prepared.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to learning. Hoping everybody else is too.
Hold on, got to find it. This is the problem with having so many windows open. Give me a second. Well,
in the meantime, everybody in the chat box, you can tell us about your latest experience with mosquitoes. Was it good or was it bad? I think I know the answer to that one. I can tell you, I think in my part of North Carolina, the month of August is one of the rainiest Augusts we've had in a while. And for what I know about mosquitoes is that they like standing water. Oh, go ahead.
No, not yet. I'm sorry. I don't know why.
No, not yet. Okay.
Why we're having trouble here. I just don't. There it is. Okay. Sorry about that. I didn't see it. And I don't know. I had another PowerPoint open from lecturing this morning. Okay. Can everybody
see that PowerPoint later?
Yeah. Yeah. I teach in the fall. I teach forensic entomology, which is also really interesting. Also involves a lot of flies, but in a different context. Okay. So can everybody see that? See that?
Yes.
That's good. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. Okay. So today I'm going to talk to you about mosquitoes. And I came up with this kind of clever title of Tigers in Toilet Bowls, Gallon Nippers, and Mother Death. And so we'll cover essentially some real basics about mosquitoes, but including some interesting anecdotes of the natural history of mosquitoes, as well as their importance in terms of public health. So first, some basics. As Chris mentioned, the theme for BugFest this year, flies. And you may wonder, is a mosquito, and why mosquitoes? Well, mosquitoes are flies, right? So, and all flies are insects. And so we're well steeped right in the middle of BugFest with this. How do we know that mosquitoes are insects? Well, we can take a look. A couple of characteristics. Legs. How many legs does a mosquito have? 3 on one side, 3 on the other, 6 legs. Sounds like a good insect to me. And then also wings, another characteristic of the insects. Okay. Now, what makes them a fly, though, is that they only have one pair of wings. The Latin name for the flies are diptera, or 2 wings. So one pair is 2 wings right there. All flies also have this little knob behind their first set of wings. That's actually what happened to the other set of wings. And insects have 4 wings. But in the flies, they've lost their hind wings and they were replaced by these little heavy knobs. And you can kind of see them right there on this mosquito. These heavy knobs help the mosquito or other flies stabilize themselves during flight. Makes them really efficient flyers. Okay. Now, as in all the other flies, mosquitoes have an egg, larval, and adult phase. So that's a very basic characteristic. And we're going to kind of structure the rest of my talk today around that life history of the mosquito, egg, larvae, and adult. And we're going to look at how that works in normal mosquitoes or typical mosquitoes, and also what the exceptions are to that for the mosquitoes that makes them really interesting. Now, the other thing, and this is going to be a little bit less important to most of you out there, but when you see something that is recognizably a mosquito, you can be sure it's a mosquito. There's a few other things that kind of look like mosquitoes, but all the things that we call mosquitoes are related to each other, and they're more closely related to each other than to any other fly. All right. And that family then of mosquitoes is called the Culicidae. All right, that's a Latin name. You don't really need to know that, but it's important to remember that when we talk about mosquitoes, we can talk about things at the level of the whole family because they share a lot of these characteristics. All right. The first topic I would like to cover is that mosquitoes are diverse. This is a montage, a collage of images of mosquitoes. This represents the diversity of mosquitoes, not in the world, and not in North America, and not even in North Carolina. This is just a sampling of the diversity that we find in Wake County. In my lab, we have caught every one of these mosquitoes at one point or another when we go out trapping for mosquitoes. That diversity is reflected in about 62 species of mosquitoes in North Carolina. I say about because there are still species to be described, and we also have species coming in. I'm going to talk about them in a little bit as well. We have about 180 species in North America, and worldwide, there's about 3,700 species worldwide. That means 3,700 different types of mosquitoes found across the planet. And they do a lot of different things. But there are some general rules that we can describe the entire family of mosquitoes with. And we're going to structure this around the life cycle of the mosquito. All right. Now, like all chicken or egg questions, we can really start anywhere in this life cycle, but let's go ahead for convenience and start down here. This is a female mosquito, and she is laying a clutch of eggs on water. This is very typical of the mosquito life history, the laying of eggs in water, on top of water, next to water. The reason that mosquitoes always lay their eggs in water or near water is because for the entire family, every mosquito out there has an immature phase called a larvae that is required to grow up in water. Right? And this is a typical mosquito. You can see they have a nice clear head. This week, when you learn about some of the other flies, the maggoty flies, you'll see that some of them aren't nearly so good looking as a mosquito larvae. And they all require water to grow up in. Interestingly, for the most part, mosquitoes cannot breathe underwater. So they have a little apparatus called a siphon that allows them to breathe air. above the water. And so this mosquito here is hanging by its siphon. The siphon is penetrating the water surface, and it's able to take in from the atmosphere in order to breathe. Now, there's a number of different ways of solving this problem, but they all need to breathe air at some point. Okay, so all mosquitoes lay eggs. All mosquito larvae have to grow up in water, all right? And after they grow up in the water, going through 4 stages as larvae, from a little larvae, like you see here, to bigger and bigger ones, they form a pupal stage. This is an image of a pupae here. This is an adult emerging from a pupal case. The pupae in mosquitoes is analogous to the cocoon of a moth or the chrysalis of a butterfly. At the Museum of Natural Sciences, if you've had the opportunity to go visit there, they have the beautiful butterfly dry rainforest or dry forest exhibit on the 4th floor, and you can see the hanging chrysalis of the developing butterflies. Well, this is the same stage, but for a mosquito. And in this case, unlike in the butterflies, the mosquito pupae is active. After a period of time as a pupae in which they don't feed, but they do breathe and they can dive, the adult mosquito emerges from a pupal case. At this point, it then is going to fly off. And as an adult, mosquitoes have to do 3 things: blood feed, mate, and develop and then lay eggs. And this completes the life cycle. This is typical of most species of mosquitoes. Things get exciting and really interesting when we look at some of the exceptions to this rule. So here I'm going to give you 3 examples of awesome exceptions, and this will also segue or lead nicely into the next section of my talk. So I'll start with really big mosquitoes, okay? Now, is a local species of mosquito, sometimes called the elephant mosquito. The proper name is Toxorhynchides rutilis. And this is a really pretty mosquito. It's large, and it's iridescent. It's got these nice white socks on its feet. But you'll notice something else about this mosquito. This mosquito isn't feeding on somebody's skin and blood. It was actually taking nectar. I took this picture in my child's piano teacher's backyard in Raleigh. This is a real local mosquito. Now, how does this mosquito get so big? Well, unlike most larvae that filter feed, this mosquito as a larvae is a predator. It's actually a predator of other mosquitoes. And this allows it to avoid one of those characteristics of adult mosquitoes, which is blood feeding. In this case, this mosquito only takes nectar as an adult. All right, so the next exception is in a different group of mosquitoes called the Cocolitidia. Is another genus, Mansonia. Sorry, you don't need to know that. We scientists sometimes have a hard time not using the Latin names. This is an example from Australia, but we have a similar mosquito here. Just couldn't find a great photo of it. What this mosquito does, that's an exception to the rule of mosquitoes, is instead of putting their siphon up into the air, they actually dig their siphon into the root of an aquatic plant. The siphon itself, and you can see how dark it is right there, that means it's really hard, looks like a little saw. And the siphon itself penetrates the root of a plant, and this allows this mosquito to breathe underwater by breathing the oxygen inside the plant tissue. It's a great adaptation to avoid having to go up to the surface and breathe atmospheric air. The last exception I'd like to bring up are typified by these 2 images. This is a egg of a species called Cerophora ferox. It's an electron micrograph, so you can see in fine detail what the looks like. And this is Aedes albopictus, the tiger mosquito, laying her eggs on a dry surface. This group of mosquitoes that includes the tiger mosquito and this floodwater mosquito that we have around here can lay eggs that don't need to be laid on water. In fact, they're often laid above water or near water, but not on the water. And that's because these eggs can dry out, and they can dry out for a period of time, weeks, months, sometimes even years. And then when they encounter water through a flood, major rainstorm, hurricane, etc., then they can hatch and complete that life cycle. And this last characteristic is going to bring me to my first important anecdote of the day, which hopefully my slide will advance. Forgot I was going to show you guys these important exceptions. And that's the tigers in your toilet bowl. Well, of course, not yours really, and it's really anything that contains small amounts of water. So again, not really your toilet bowl in your house, but if you were to leave it outside and let rainwater fill in, then we would end up with these tigers. These are a group of species of mosquitoes. They're not all closely related to each other, but they share one common characteristic, which is that ancestrally, before there were people around, these mosquitoes all utilized small bodies of water that collect in the environment. Most typically, something like this tree hole. This is a picture I took years ago in Florida, but it's a great image of a tree hole. You can see it collects rainwater. It's got some leaf material that falls in that provides nutrients for the mosquito larvae. And these mosquitoes would lay their eggs around the edges of this habitat. When the habitat flooded, the eggs would hatch, wriggle down inside, and then be happy little mosquitoes developing. All right? Now, this characteristic of utilizing these natural small bodies of water that are pretty ephemeral, which means that they come and go pretty quickly, has allowed these mosquitoes to take advantage of all of the things that we make as humans that can collect rainwater. Maybe most famously, tires. So if you go out pretty much almost anywhere in the United States and you look around hard enough, you can find a discarded rubber car tire. And this is a perfect habitat to collect rainwater, to collect leaf material, and to generate lots of these, what I'm calling tiger mosquitoes as a group. And you can see here's the same kind of thing. This is an old styrofoam cooler in an old abandoned boat somewhere. And you can see there's rainwater that's collected in this. Perfect habitat for these mosquitoes. Okay. And what that has allowed, that ability of the mosquitoes to shift from a habitat, say a tree hole or a rock pool or a small, any small thing that could hold rainwater, but into something artificial, has allowed mosquitoes that can do this to spread around the world with some pretty important consequences. The two most important species are the tiger mosquito, which is this black and silver one, and the yellow fever mosquito, which is this chocolate brown, we'll say, and striped one. The yellow fever mosquito, Aedes aegypti, as you imagine by its name, is important in the transmission of yellow fever. The tiger mosquito is the #1 pest in Raleigh, and it can also transmit yellow fever, as well as dengue, Zika, chikungunya fever. Both of these can transmit all of those viruses. Now, those are the two most famous ones, Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus. But we see across all of these mosquitoes that can utilize these habitats a general invasion. So for example, in addition to the tiger mosquito, we also have Aedes japonicus, now here in North Carolina, also a pest mosquito. Out in California, they have recently been invaded Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus, so yellow fever and tiger mosquito. And then this mosquito from Australia as well, Aedes nodoscriptus. They're similar looking in a lot of ways. It's not just here either. This is Aedes coreicus from Korea, and this is or from Asia in general, named after the Korean peninsula. And this mosquito has invaded Europe. And in all fairness, although many of these come from Asia and this one from Australia, we also have our own species, Aedes atropalpus, and we've exported this species to Europe, and now it's an invasive species in Europe. So these tigers in the toilet bowl, problem. All right, the next story I want to tell you is about the gallon nippers, or the giant mosquitoes that can nip a gallon of blood. And this story we can start with hurricanes. I took this image off of Yale's website recently. These are some tropical storms forming, potentially becoming hurricanes and headed our way. And during a hurricane event, there is usually lots and lots of rainfall, right? And that leads to flooding. This is an image of flooding after Florence in North Carolina. And along with flooding comes lots of mosquito larvae. You know how I mentioned that species, Serophora ferox, can lay eggs that can last for a long time in a dry state, sometimes years? Well, when you have major flooding, all of those eggs get flooded, and we get millions, billions of mosquitoes emerging from that. Now, when we have lots of mosquitoes like this, it also allows predatory mosquitoes to become more abundant. This is a mosquito called Serophora ciliata. It's commonly known as the gala nipper. With so many larval mosquitoes we see during hurricanes, we suddenly see a lot more of these mosquitoes. And it wouldn't be a big deal. There still aren't as many of these mosquitoes as there are of just plain old biting mosquitoes, but these mosquitoes are big. All right, this is a picture of one on somebody's hand, and you can see it's about the size of a knuckle digit in your hand, and that's a noticeably mosquito. Now, unlike that first large mosquito I showed you, this one does suck blood. It's a predator on other mosquitoes, which probably allows it to get to such a large size, but this one also sucks blood. And it can really suck so much blood that it feels like you're losing a gallon of blood. I was bit by one of these mosquitoes. Well, I've been bit by these mosquitoes numerous occasions, but I was bit by one of these mosquitoes in which I let the mosquito bite my hand and I watched it. And she filled up with so much blood that she couldn't even fly. She just kind of fell to the ground, which kind of says how much blood these mosquitoes can take. Now, this got a lot of press after Florence because there was a tremendous explosion of mosquitoes, including these giant mosquitoes. And so we saw lots of headlines like these: giant mosquitoes emerge in North Carolina post-Florence. Now, this is from CNN, and I'm sorry, what they showed was a yellow fever mosquito, so not the right mosquito at all. But they did interview me for this topic. Okay. Now, the final topic I want to talk about, and then we'll have plenty of time to entertain questions, is the last part of my title, Mother Death. So let's take an example of an infectious disease like COVID-19. We're living in this time of a pandemic. It's a very sad time. We've lost a lot of people during this period of time. But a pathogen, a virus like COVID-19, is transmitted through the air when it's expelled from one person and then is caught by another person. Now, epidemiologists have a way of characterizing infectious disease, and it's a term called R0 or R0. It's called R0 because the English, people from the United Kingdom really started us off on modeling diseases mathematically, and so they get to call it R0, but you can call it R0 or R0. And it's just a way of comparing different infectious diseases with how rapidly they can spread. It is essentially if an infected person comes into a population of people, so a group of people in which infected, how many new cases will that person cause? And so for COVID, the estimates have been between 2.5 and 3.5. So for each case of COVID, that person can infect between 2.5 and 3.5 people. Now, that's a theoretical idea. The reality is sometimes a little different from that, but that's the idea. And it gives you a ballpark on what to compare. Influenza is actually slightly lower. Measles is much higher. Get the idea. The interesting thing is that same concept can be applied to mosquito-borne diseases. But in this case, instead of somebody coughing a virus from one person to another, a mosquito is going to pick it up and carry it from one person to another. And not just a virus. It could be a malaria parasite. I looked up estimates of R0 for dengue and malaria, and here was the interesting thing. The estimates range from about 3, in which a new case of dengue would cause about 1.3 other cases of dengue, to over 500. Some estimates of malaria suggest, and are not, of around 3,000, meaning one infected person, with the assistance of mosquitoes, could infect 3,000 susceptible people. We have known about the diseases carried by mosquitoes for some time. Probably the most ancient disease that we have really good historical information about is malaria, right? We know it from antiquity. There are writings of early Greek physicians, Hippocrates and Galen, that have described the symptoms of malaria. And they have a very specific type of symptoms in terms of a fever that comes and goes on a very strict periodicity. And so we know it was malaria. It is a human disease, not carried by animals, not human malaria anyway. It is worldwide. And historically, it's been present all over the place. This lightest orange color represents the historical distribution of malaria. So you can see that historically, all of the eastern United States, up into Canada, were susceptible or had malaria. Likewise, Scandinavia, Finland had malaria. We've shrunk this area that has malaria so that now it's primarily restricted to the tropics, where in Africa, it's a major killer of people, mostly children, probably the second largest killer of children in Africa. Malaria is transmitted by just one genus of mosquitoes, Anopheles, but a bunch of different species within that genus. Oh, sorry, there you go. The next group of diseases, viruses in this case, transmitted by mosquitoes, are Zika, dengue, and yellow fever. And these share really common characteristics. These are diseases of globalization. Whereas we think malaria was probably with humans, maybe since in humans, these diseases only were spread rapidly, at least, or only spread to a large segment of the world's population during the process of globalization. 16th century for yellow fever, 18th century for dengue fever, and the 21st century for Zika. However, all of these pathogens are still with us and still make public health threats. Particularly dengue is a major current threat to us. They all utilize these tiger mosquitoes that dwell in the containers that can fill up with rainwater that surround our environment. Some of them are pretty mild. Dengue almost never kills people if it's the first time you get it. Yellow fever, on the other hand, as depicted in this image, can kill and kill rapidly, and it's a fairly horrific disease. Some, like Zika, are mostly mild, but we have associated these with birth defects, which is a tremendous public health issue. The next group of diseases caused by mosquito bites is encephalitis. And for these pathogens, they're viral in nature. We have homegrown examples and exotic examples. Homegrown examples would be things like Eastern equine encephalitis. Exotics would be things like West Nile virus. These are a little bit different. In the case of dengue, yellow fever, and Zika, it's transmitted person to mosquito to person. These encephalitis-causing pathogens are usually transmitted from an animal to a person, often birds, not always, but often birds. And people actually end up just being accidental hosts, not really meant to have the virus. The virus is not adapted to being in people. We usually can't transmit the virus, but it can make people really sick. It can lead to death, coma, paralysis, or a persistent vegetative state, all of which, of course, are really dangerous. And interestingly, they can use a diversity of mosquitoes to transmit this pathogen, as a bridge from the animals to people. Okay, and then the final pathogen I want to talk about is not a human pathogen, not a human disease caused by mosquitoes, but a carnivore disease, really a dog disease, and that's dog heartworm. right? This is a pathogen that is found literally in your backyard. Um, you can see here's a map. The darker orange, the more cases of dog heartworm have been detected. The gray means they don't have data from those counties, but you can see that we have some in Wake County and even more in the, if you go east of Wake County especially, and it's a nationwide disease as well. It primarily infects dogs and other canids. So those are things like foxes, wolves, coyotes. But actually most carnivores can catch dog heartworm. And in fact, it's fatal to cats, pretty quickly fatal to cats. It is ultimately fatal to dogs too, although they tolerate it a little bit better than cats do, and you can treat them. Cats, it's a little more tricky. So people generally don't think to treat their cat with dog heartworm medicine, but it's a good, or with cat heartworm medicine, I should say, but it's a good idea because it can be prevented. And our studies, including studies in our lab, suggest that many species could be good vectors of heartworm. Okay, so the last little bit, I've talked for about 25 minutes, it looks like, or so. And sorry about the screen sharing at the beginning. Let me just kind of end by talking about control and prevention. So mosquitoes are fascinating creatures. They're everywhere. They're going to be with us. But ostensibly, their role as transmitters of disease means that we can prevent those diseases. We can control mosquito populations reasonably and therefore prevent disease. Right? It's unlikely that we're going to be able to eliminate mosquitoes from the planet, certainly not the family of mosquitoes, but even eliminating a single species would be a real challenge. And so we really need a robust public health response to mosquito-borne diseases because we can control and prevent them. Okay, I think that was the last thing I wanted to say. I just thank some of our funders, my lab and the Wiegman lab that I work with closely. You'll hear from Brian Wiegman, I believe, about flies. He's a more general fly scientist on Wednesday, I think. So somebody should check me on that. And then I took a bunch of images from a bunch of different people and sources, so I want to thank them as well. And I will stop sharing my screen and open myself up to questions. I think Chris is going to moderate the questions. So hopefully everybody enjoyed that.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Excellent stuff. That was an in-depth but exciting look at the world of mosquitoes.
Thanks. It's always a challenge to limit oneself as to what to cover. So I'm sure there's a lot of questions, a lot of things I didn't cover.
Yes, we did get quite a few questions here in the chat. But since you ended on this just sort of idea of control and prevention, I'm going to throw out the first one because I'm curious what you think about some of these efforts to introduce genetically modified mosquitoes. I heard about programs in the Keys in Florida. I've heard about programs across the African continent as well, because the diseases that these mosquitoes carry can be so deadly.
Yeah, so I have a few opinions about this. They're not particularly scientifically informed opinions, which is to say, I mean, I'm a scientist, I study mosquitoes, but I haven't personally done empirical studies on the genetically modified mosquitoes that are being deployed. But I do have some opinions on this subject. I think in the case of public health threats, we need all weapons available. That includes genetically modified mosquitoes. I think that when you look at the relative risk, and I don't mean that in the purely public health sense, but just what's going to be more dangerous to the wider environment between a genetically modified mosquito and spraying lots of pesticides, I think genetically modified mosquitoes are clearly superior in that way. They're much more targeted. They're generally targeted to a single species of mosquito. So if you love mosquitoes like I do, you're not even that worried about them taking away the other horrible pest mosquitoes that we all hate, but don't transmit disease. I think that from what I've seen of the data, it is moderately to very effective at reducing mosquito populations. On the other side, they require a lot of investment because in order to utilize them, you have to rear them. You have to grow a lot of mosquitoes. That's kind of how the systems work. So you have to invest in a place that can grow billions of mosquitoes, millions a week, billions over a year. But that's jobs for people, I mean, so there's, you likely have to keep doing it, you're not going to get one-time control and eliminate a mosquito, but that's also kind of a good thing because, choosing to eliminate a species entirely is runs into philosophical questions. Yeah, and the private, there's one major private company that is in this realm, at least in the container mosquitoes, and they're for profit, so they're also going to make money off of public. A little bit of a debate in my mind, what that could do to what really should be, I think, a public utility controlling mosquitoes. But all in all, I'm in favor of it, I would say. Okay.
Well, I think it's good to hear.
I went way too deep on that.
Right. No, I mean, that's great. I mean, I asked because you obviously think a lot about mosquitoes, and I was just curious about it. Like, I was reading about the project in Florida, and those mosquitoes are invasive in North America. So, yeah, we talk about getting rid of invasive plants and invasive species all the time because of the negative impact they have on our, present and current wildlife and interaction. So,
yeah,
no, that was great. Thanks.
Yeah, although in fairness, that species, it's invasive, but it's been here since the 15th or the 17th century probably. So
for a while.
Yeah, it's been here for a while. Now we've gotten rid of it in some places. That's a whole nother story. But yeah.
All right. Well, let me grab some probably better questions from the chat box.
Oh, that was a great question.
Some good things. Let's see. Shirley wants to know more about mosquitoes as pollinators.
Okay, cool. So that's Charlie?
Shirley.
Oh, Shirley. Sorry, Shirley. Okay, yeah. So there's actually some really interesting stuff. And I showed you a picture of a mosquito nectar feeding on a flower. That's everybody's favorite mosquito. That's the one that eats other mosquitoes and doesn't blood feed. Mosquitoes can serve as pollinators. We see them particularly attracted to flowers that have lots of small flowers. So goldenrod, yarrow, mints, like that picture that I took was on a mint. But there's also some evidence that there are a few orchid species, ground orchids, particularly in the western United States, a little Pacific Northwest and Canada, that specialize in using mosquitoes. They actually produce smells that are not sweet, not to attract honeybees or butterflies, but actually smell a little funky, like a animal breath. And these orchids specialize in using flies, but also mosquitoes. One of the really neat things about these orchids is they don't just put a few tiny microscopic pollen grains on the mosquito. They actually glue a big sac called a pollinia on the mosquito. It actually can be a little bit of a burden for a little mosquito to fly around with this big pollen sac glued to it. Although a lot of the mosquitoes out there, these are kind of mountainous, floodwater mosquitoes, they get pretty big too. So. Okay, I hope that answered your question, Shirley.
That's okay, interesting. Yeah. An orchid that wants to attract mosquitoes.
Yep, and has chemicals it produces to attract them. Specific, well, I don't know about specific to mosquitoes, but specific to things that would go to an animal instead of a flower.
All right, let me grab some more here. Let's see. Oh, Abby wants to know how you trap mosquitoes.
Okay. Well, how do I trap mosquitoes, or how does anybody trap mosquitoes? I guess we can't really follow up and get some clarification. So I'll cover both. The way that there's a number of ways of trapping mosquitoes. We take advantage of essentially what does a mosquito do in its life as an adult to trap them. So there's essentially two major things that a mosquito does. There's really three, but one we haven't quite figured out how to use effectively. But the major things that a mosquito does in its adult life is feed on blood and lay eggs. And so our trapping approaches involve one of those two things, either catching mosquitoes that are trying to feed on blood or that are trying to lay their eggs. And so to catch mosquitoes that are looking to take blood, we use carbon dioxide. I get it at local supermarkets. I often get it to do with it because I buy it for the university. And, people want ice, but that's where I get to. And then we use that as an attractant. We can also use, there's some chemicals that have been developed that essentially smell a bit funky, probably a little bit like one of those orchids actually, but that smell a little bit like a locker room, if you will. Yeah, it's a shame if one of those breaks open in your field truck. But we use those as well. Those also can attract mosquitoes. And then we also attract mosquitoes that are trying to lay their eggs. And we do that by providing a kind of habitat, an aquatic habitat that they would like. So for those container tiger mosquitoes, we use a small black cup filled with water and then lined with paper, and they lay their eggs on the paper above the water. So those are really the two major ways. And there's some other ways. You can sit outside with an aspirator, essentially like a straw to suck up mosquitoes and let them come to you. You can even just go out with like a big vacuum cleaner like apparatus and collect them from the bushes. But those tend to be lower yield for more effort than having a trap. We usually don't trap larval mosquitoes. If we want to catch them as larvae, we just go out with a dipper and dip and get them out. Yeah.
So you don't send undergrads out with just like no sleeves and make them stand in the field.
No, I will tell you, there was a time before I was a scientist, maybe with undergrads or often, for people studying malaria or dengue in other parts of the world. But needless to say, we've learned a lot about what is morally appropriate for scientists to do. And we do not do that kind of stuff anymore. The one exception is that the scientists themselves can sometimes get permission to do it to themselves. So I keep some of our mosquitoes alive by feeding them on my arm. But we try to really minimize that. And I'm the only one in my lab allowed to do that. I can't make an undergrad or a grad student or a technician do that. So the university lets me do it, but that's it. So, yeah.
Okay, interesting. Okay, there's lots of questions coming in. So let me grab another one here. Is there an estimate of what % of the tiger mosquito population in North Carolina that transmits yellow fever?
Oh, that's a good question. So we generally say that in laboratory studies that the tiger mosquito, Aedes albopictus, is competent for yellow fever, which means that in the lab, if you feed it blood that has yellow fever viruses in the blood, that at some period of time later, 4 to 10 days, depending on the temperature you're keeping your mosquitoes, there will be yellow fever virus saliva of the tiger mosquito. Okay? That being said, we don't have yellow fever in North Carolina. Essentially, it's incredibly hard for me to believe we ever would see outbreaks of yellow fever in North Carolina. With that in mind, I could say 0% of the tiger mosquito. Now, if you can imagine rolling us back 150, well, let's see, what year are we in now? Sorry, COVID tends to do that. So rolling us back 200 years, right? 150 to 200 years ago. And we had the tiger mosquito. It used to be the Asian tiger mosquito. We don't call it that anymore. Tiger mosquito here in North Carolina. I think there's a good chance that you could get cases of yellow fever transmitted by the tiger mosquito. Back in those days, here in North Carolina, our major threat was the yellow fever mosquito, Aedes aegypti. It was found throughout North Carolina, and this was true up until the 1980s. Even in Raleigh, you could find that mosquito. In the 1980s, the tiger mosquito, the real proper tiger mosquito, the black and silver one that I showed you, invaded North America, came from Japan, actually in a shipment of tires, used tires, and it spread throughout the United States, or throughout this, well, now it's up into New York, Connecticut, just barely, and into California. But in the 1980s, it spread throughout the southeastern United States. It actually outcompeted the yellow fever mosquito. And after about the early 1990s, you just couldn't find the yellow fever mosquito in North Carolina. We've been looking pretty hard over the last decade for the yellow fever mosquito. We still don't have it in North Carolina. It's in Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, up on the coast, but we still down in Wilmington, where you might eventually expect it. But I digress. To answer the question, I don't think any tiger mosquitoes in North Carolina are likely to transmit yellow fever. So probably ever.
Katie wants to know why it would be more adaptive to have a large outbreak of mosquitoes after a flooding event.
That's a good question. That's a great question. It's actually something I've been really curious about myself recently. It seems like certain species are favored through evolutionary time by a boom and bust adaptive strategy, maintaining a low level of population during most of the time, and then occasionally floating, as we saw. And there are certain characteristics that go along with that. One is actually relatively large size, incredibly high fecundity, low investment in eggs. And that's, if there are ecologists out there in the world, that's kind of what we would think of as an optimum strategy. And I'm sorry for some of you out there, like, what is he talking about? Essentially what that means is that the mother mosquito is favored to produce lots of eggs, and most of the time, most of those eggs don't result in making it all the way to being another mother mosquito laying eggs. But on those occasions, when they do, it is favored to have laid lots and lots of eggs. And so that strategy over time can be effective. I think what becomes really interesting is how the frequency of these major events shapes that strategy. If the events are too rare and the eggs die in between, then maybe there is no benefit to that strategy. If the events are very frequent, well, maybe then we see shifts in the durability or survivability of those eggs that form what we call an egg bank. It's a really interesting question. I think it's something that I personally have become very interested in the last couple of years, but haven't received funding yet to study it. But something we're really, I think, is really important, and I think it also might be important in the transmission of dog heartworm, and because I think it really, that pathogen really takes advantage of rare events when it can have lots of transmission based upon the biology. But yeah, to go into that, we're gonna have to. I could spend the next half an hour talking about that, so better move on. But great question, thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, Tessa wants to know if mosquitoes contribute positively to the world in any way.
Yeah, I mean, my lab also studies ticks. I struggle with that question for ticks, but for mosquitoes, I can tell you lots of really good things. I think the question from Shirley touched on pollination, and so, yeah, we all know pollination's important. I think there is a talk later in the week about flies as the forgotten pollinators, and I'll give a little shout out to my other Diptera buddies out there. Flies are really important in pollination, in some places more important than bees, but bees get all the press, Mosquitoes are probably not, critical pollinators, but we do see, as I mentioned with this orchid, that some species seem to be adapted to using mosquitoes. So that suggests that if you got rid of the mosquitoes as a whole family, you would lose the bluntleaf orchid of the Pacific Northwest because it wouldn't have an effective pollinator. So I think that's one thing. The second thing or point, and there's a number of these. I've made lists in the past, so I'm kind of ready for this question. But the second thing that I think people don't always appreciate is this bipartite life, which means that when they're young, when they're larvae, mosquitoes are in an aquatic environment, and when they're adults, they're in a aerial terrestrial environment. Means that they can be very effective at moving nutrients from one habitat to another habitat. There are very few other organisms, and really most of the other ones are also flies, but in different families of flies than the Helicidae. But there are very few organisms that can really take advantage of some of these kind of weird aquatic environments. You know, if you talk to an aquatic ecologist, they mostly work on lakes and streams, maybe salt marshes, but there's a whole bunch of aquatic environments out there that aren't those. There's the tree holes that I mentioned. There's little ephemeral pools of water that only last 3 weeks, you know, in the spring. There's snow pools from melting snow, not in North Carolina, but up in the mountains, up in the Arctic area. And far and away, the most important group of animals that can take advantage of those kind of aquatic habitats are mosquitoes. And so they're moving nutrients that would otherwise be lost in these small aquatic habitats up into the terrestrial environment. And then they're consumed by frogs, by spiders, by bats. Yes, bats do eat mosquitoes, not exclusively. They mostly survive other insects, but they will eat mosquitoes, dragonflies, other predators. And so another important role that mosquitoes play is in moving nutrients around ecosystems, making connections between ecosystems, and making available nutrients in aquatic ecosystems really no other group is as well adapted to taking advantage of. So those are two really good ecosystem kind of services, you might say, that mosquito can do. There are some other things. They serve some roles in maybe regulating populations. That gets a little dark, you know. So, but food for predators, connections between food webs, and then pollination. We'll go with that.
I like it. I mean, that's a pretty good list.
Yeah,
It's a pretty good.
I have more, but I got it. Yeah, that's good. Okay.
Cool. Let's see. Shannon is asking, what are some of the threats to mosquitoes? They're important.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah, exactly. If they're important. As far as I know, there are some species that are very rare, but I don't know any mosquito that's made the endangered species list yet. So, I mean, the major threat to mosquitoes is almost certainly a habitat modification, habitat loss. You know, one thing that we have seen in research in my own lab is as we convert natural areas, and natural areas around here are all secondary growth forests, you know, or clear grasslands in some places, like abandoned pastures, that kind of thing. But as we convert those into suburban dwellings, we see a precipitous decline in mosquito diversity. We go from about, on average, 8 or 9 species at a given site based upon trapping that we do, to 3 to 4 species at a site. And it actually correlates strongly with neighborhood age. The older a neighborhood is, the less diverse the mosquito assemblage is, the less number of species of mosquitoes that we see. So, you know, with that in mind, it's probably local habitat destruction that is the biggest threat to mosquitoes. At the same time, we also often want to threaten mosquitoes, right? We don't really like mosquitoes in our backyard. If I went out into my backyard right now, it would take probably about 3 minutes before I had a tiger mosquito trying to feed on me. And so they are, you know, a pain, and we kind of want to threaten them. And people do use chemical pesticides for control. I'm sure everybody in the audience has seen the signs up for various mosquito control approaches. Those generally use a that is going to kill a mosquito. It'll probably kill other insects too if it hits them, and so that's also a threat to mosquito, though it's a purposeful one, you know. meant to threaten. Yeah.
Right, true. John is asking, do mosquitoes get a benefit from carrying a disease like malaria? And then there was a follow up. Are there any diseases or parasites that affect mosquitoes, from another user?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question. The the long and short of it is that there hasn't been a lot of evidence for benefits. There has been some evidence for harm. Malaria tends to be one of the more benign um, pathogens in the mosquito in terms of what it does to the mosquito. We have seen pathogens do things like shorten the mosquito lifespan, increase the feeding behavior of mosquitoes, which makes sense. If you're a pathogen in a mosquito, you want out of that mosquito. You want into the next person or animal. Some pathogens have really bad effects. So we do a lot of work with dog heartworm in my lab. It's a really interesting pathogen. And that pathogen can easily kill a mosquito. And in fact, it probably kills more mosquitoes than it actually can use to get transmitted from one to another. So, so most pathogens are either neutral to bad for the mosquito, but the mosquito is also their lifeboat. So they may manipulate the mosquito in a way to encourage transmission of the pathogen. And they generally can't be very pathogenic or fatal to the mosquito. The mosquito's got to live long enough to get to the next person, and for that pathogen to have developed or replicated or reproduced itself in the mosquito. And what was the follow-up? I'm sorry, was that, did
Are
that
there any
cover?
diseases or parasites that affect mosquitoes?
Oh, yeah, okay. So I think we covered that. Like I said, dog heartworm has a tremendously negative effect on mosquitoes. The viruses and malaria tend to be more mild, but we have documented life-shortening effects of infection, as well as changes in behavior.
Very interesting. I wouldn't have thought that about the dog heartworm.
Yeah, well, it's
So
an
deadly to
interesting.
mosquitoes.
It's an interesting pathogen because a dog heartworm, it has to develop in a mosquito. You cannot. You can inject a dog who is infected with heartworm. You can inject the blood of that dog into another dog, and it won't cause dog heartworm. The worm has to go through a mosquito in order to complete its life cycle. But it kills a lot of mosquitoes. It infects. The worms actually get relatively big for a mosquito. It's like carrying around this big thing. Oh, I should. What is the relative size? I mean, it's probably like having a small, like, say, a coral snake living, or maybe even bigger, maybe even a good sized rat snake living in your stomach, something like that. Relative size to a human. I'm gonna have to figure that out exactly at some point. That's a good analogy. So it does have this tremendously negative effect on the mosquito, even though it needs the mosquito to get to the next dog. And so it's really fascinating how that could develop, how that could evolve and work. It lives a really long time in dogs, years and years, and it only really has to be transmitted twice during that period of time for the population of dog heartworm to continue to spread. So, yeah.
There are a lot of questions about this next topic, so maybe we
Okay.
can hit them all at once. People
Great.
are really curious about repellents or other ways to keep mosquitoes off of you.
Yeah.
Blood-sucking mosquitoes off of you.
Yeah. So the truth is nothing beats DEET in terms of effectiveness. A lot of people don't like DEET. They don't like how it smells. They don't like the fact that it will dissolve plastics. That's a little disconcerting to people. I will say, as far as we know, there are no major linked long-term chronic health issues with DEET exposure, but nevertheless, it is not a favored one. Although I would say for short term, you're not going to use it every day, but you're going to go on a hike where you're going to encounter a lot of mosquitoes. DEET still has the longest lasting, most effective repellent. There are other ones out there on the market. There are now spatial repellents that can make a kind of cloud of repellent insecticide. Again, you still have to ask yourself, do I want to breathe in a pesticide that attacks the nervous system of insects, or do I want a repellent possibly going through my skin that affects the CO2 reception system of insects? It's a tough question. Other options are chemically treated clothing. So permethrin treated clothing is effective repellent. But heavy long sleeves, heavy pants will keep them off too. In July, that's not always a very pleasant choice either to have to make. There are, there's lots of purported spatial repellents like, lemon scented geraniums, citronella torches, etc. Those tend not to be that effective. One thing that is somewhat effective and is entirely toxic free is to have fairly serious fans going. I guess I have a fan behind me, but I'm on a nice screen point. So, but is to have some serious wind going. That actually mosquitoes do not like flying in the wind. They're not great flyers. So you can even set up with a couple of strong fans on your, outside on your patio, and maybe keep them a little bit at bay, with just wind. So, yeah.
Which on a hot
would be nice.
July day in North Carolina is nice anyway.
Yeah, you got to get an extension cord, and you're not doing anything for your carbon footprint, but we all got to make choices, Yeah.
Good. And yeah, there was a question too about plants that repel. You see in stores, the citronella plant has a big placard on it.
Yeah.
Says that it repels mosquitoes.
All of the studies I know have failed to show any real effect of those. So, they're pretty plants. I'm all in favor of horticulture. They smell nice. I don't think, especially in a kind of spatial way, that they would be that effective. Mosquito coils can be somewhat effective. You're burning a insecticide, actually. But, again, I think you would want to, think about what, the relative danger of that versus putting on DEET versus sweating it out with long pants and long sleeve shirt, that kind of thing. But again, everybody's got to make their own personal choice.
All right. Well, I'm looking at the clock now. It looks like I am over time with you.
Okay.
So since we were talking about repellents here, I'll remind everybody that at 2:00 today, we'll be talking about repellents. That'll be part of the 2 p.m. program. So to get more information about that, head to bugfest.org. Look at the programs and events tab at that website. And there you can see the information for all of the upcoming BugFest programs. We've got stuff happening all day, every day this week. So visit that, tune in. You can get the information that you need to sign up for that program and get the information to participate. So I hope that we'll see you there. Everybody, like I said, there are a ton of amazing programs happening this week. You can follow along with BugFest activities at bugfest.org. Follow the museum on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're at Natural Sciences on all 3 platforms. That's easy to remember. And you can also subscribe to the museum's YouTube channel right here. And then every day when we're going live with BugFest programming at noon, you'll get a notification and can tune in. We've also got a lot of other cool programs happening on YouTube this week as well, like our Science Cafe on Thursday night. So all that said, lots of great stuff. Don't miss out. I want you to take advantage of all of the great BugFest programs that we have going. Michael, thank you for being here and sharing your expertise with us.
Hold on. There. Thank you so much, Chris. This was a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed it. And I miss BugFest, but this is the next best thing. So, my hummingbird friend just flew by too, so it's nice to be outside and while giving these things. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Good.
Well, thank you again. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Take care. Stay safe. We'll see you again real soon. Bye, everybody.